This is Sleeping in Trees, the audiobook. Chapter 22, It Must Be Sunday. Much of the landscape of 1960s South Miami was characterized by southern yellow pines. They also went by the name loblolly. We just call them pine trees. The word loblolly means low, wet place. Given the preponderance of low, wet places where we roamed, the name fit well. There are a lot of loblollies in the U.S., and only the red maple tree is more prevalent. The loblolly is a tall and thin tree, rarely more than 2 feet in diameter. It's covered with a shiny and slippery bark, not unlike an alligator's hide. The branches tend to bunch up at the top, so it's very difficult to climb a loblolly. In fact, we usually avoided them altogether, unless we were in the mood to chop one down. My crew and I grew up with all manner of cutting tools. We never saw a chainsaw, so early were they in their development, and out of our league. But we had many an axe, machete, and saw. If we needed or wanted to, we could fell a tree, and we did. Not infrequently, just to experience the thrill of a timbering tree, we would head straight into the woods with our axes and chop one down. We became proficient. The woods became thinner. We learned to alternate the cut and set the correct angle as we swung the axe and how to estimate the trajectory of the fall. To hear the trunk cracking after half an hour of chopping and yelling "timber" to no one in particular was a stimulating exercise on an otherwise hot and boring South Miami day. It was a Sunday afternoon, and I was in the backyard with Lobster, messing around. The cloud of angst and gloom that always approached at that time was arriving right on cue. I didn't care for school, nor it for me. Friday afternoons were the pinnacle in my weekly mood cycle. I was positively euphoric whenever I headed down the street on a dusky Friday evening. As the weekend rolled into Saturday and then Sunday, my ebullience would leak slowly away and fade into a Sunday afternoon slump. As Monday began to look like reality, my mood would grow dark. Lobster told me he was going to climb our pine tree that stood errantly next to a stand of Australian pines. The tree was always oddly placed, and I would guess it was leftover from when the builder originally constructed the house. It probably survived all those years only by happenstance, as it made no sense in the order of a professional landscape yard. Lobster was quirky and always stood out, the dark-complected one in a brood of blonde and blue-eyed brothers. He was also left-handed. Our eyesight was 20/20, yet he wore glasses. Whenever we went out to dinner, he would quickly locate the most expensive entree, typically surf and turf, and order up. While Ding and I had spaghetti or a cheeseburger, Lobster would feast on steak and lobster. Mom and Dad dined on indigestion. He was also perpetually injured. My memories of him from childhood always included a cast, splint, or some stitches. Most Sunday afternoons he managed to partake in some act that inflicted injury upon his body. My mother used to say if Lobster was seriously hurt, it must be Sunday. I remember one finger in particular. It was a pinky. He broke it so many times that on one Sunday afternoon trip to our good friend and orthopedic surgeon, Dr. Virgin, he asked my dad if he would just like him to remove it. I believe he was serious. With Lobster's eyes bugged wide open, Dad hesitated momentarily, gazed out the window in thought, and then declined the doctor's offer of a practical solution to a chronic problem. It is, perhaps, a gross understatement to say that Lobster kept my dad on his toes. One brazen act in particular may have topped all others in its shocking absurdity. Dad, as the artist, painted various landscapes, usually of boats at anchor in a harbor. These were not his best work, in my opinion. As a sculptor, his subjects had more appeal. Like thousands of other artists have since the beginning of time, he celebrated the human form. In this iteration, it was of a nude female torso, crafted in brown clay. For weeks and weeks, he sculpted the figure in his workshop. Clay can be a messy material to work with, so rather than sculpting in the family room or out on the patio, he felt the shop, with its sawdust-covered floor and a perceived measure of privacy, was the logical place to create this particular art form. The area was not secure. With 2 unlocked entrances, anyone could wander through day or night. We all did, entering and exiting at will. My dad's tools were always going missing. With doors left unlocked and often ajar, any one of our crew in need of a pair of pliers or a file or hammer knew right where to go. They seemed to do so as a regular practice. Over the years, it was always the same. His shop was a mess, and his tools were hardly ever where they were supposed to be, or, quote, where I just left them an hour ago, quote. My admiration swells when I consider the immense productivity of a man who spent so much time hunting for the implements he needed to build the things he built. His latest work slowly took shape and was magnificent, a beautiful celebration of the female body. Given this was just a torso, the brood of young boys on tour focused mostly on the breasts and buttocks, which were well proportioned and finely crafted in shape and balance. We speculated quite often about who the model might be. My buddies were always impressed with the swift racing craft Dad built, but this sculpture impressed them even more. As the neighborhood boys spread the word about the local artist at work, the grumbling and sideways glances among our adult neighbors soon started to swell. The joy of creating and celebrating art in its purest of forms came to an abrupt halt one day when Lobster, testing the finely honed edge of a newly sharpened machete, was motivated to hack off the sculpture's delightful breasts and bulbous butt cheeks. Without these shapely attributes, the sculpture immediately lacked a certain appeal, and the interest in my dad's art quickly waned. The shop traffic among the neighborhood boys dropped precipitously. Dad was furious, of course. He could not understand what had driven his very namesake to carry out this disrespectful and destructive act. I believe Lobster received a swift and thorough spanking. Rather than reattach the severed parts, Dad just abandoned the work in disgust. My crew and I were all quite disappointed. Lobster was also always the one to go first. Whether it was jumping off a diving board into the dark waters of Rock Lake, or swinging out on a newly installed and untested rope swing over the Vine Fort, or leaping off Snapper Creek Bridge into the brackish canal below, he always stepped up. Call it brave or call it something else, but Lobster was often first in line. Occasionally, Dinkle would beat him to it. If our bikes were an actual color like blue or green or red, Lobster's had to be black. If we were discussing sailboats at the kitchen counter over a spaghetti dinner, he would interrupt with a story about powerboats. While we would cruise around on our mini bikes responsibly at 20 miles per hour, he found a way to override the governor that limited speed. He'd reach down wearing a black leather glove, press the little lever, and with the other hand gripping the handlebar, race full throttle at 40 miles per hour around the neighborhood, only ever slightly in control. With Lobster, birthday or Christmas presents were never what one could imagine or, for that matter, what any adolescent even needed. I have no idea how he discovered the things that he just had to have. It was 1963, and he somehow found a Sony TV the size of a shoebox and coerced my parents into sourcing one. One Christmas, I was ecstatic over a new bike while he received the oddest of contraptions. It was basically a bright yellow inner tube with a small gasoline engine cradled inside. An aluminum frame held it all together. It had long yellow hoses that attached to black neoprene masks. 2 people would don swimsuits, better yet wetsuits, which of course Lobster had, slip-on flippers, and the masks, grab a couple of spear guns, which of course Lobster had, and as the little gas engine buzzed and bobbed up on the bay, oxygen was pumped down through the hoses to the divers below. One could cruise around near the murky bottom unimpeded while looking for any number of targets to impale and bring home. It is no wonder that Lobster figures so prominently in so many of the tales. His combination of quirkiness, sense of adventure, intrepid nature, and fearlessness put him at the epicenter repeatedly of episodes of high adventure and adolescent bravado. Back to the loblolly. At some point a few years earlier, we had tried to build a tree house in our orphan scrub pine. I remember the ladder we built by nailing chunks of scrap wood directly to the trunk. Climbing them was always a gamble, since we had nailed them haphazardly. They were split, loose, and prone to shearing off. On more than one occasion, one of us was left dangling high up. The tree house itself was a wreck. It was 30 feet in the air, and when we finally clambered to the construction site, always sweating profusely, we had to somehow hang on to the tree while holding a board in place. Then we'd have to quickly nail it down before we lost our purchase and tumbled to the ground. Surprisingly, no one was ever pitched out of the tree, but the building method was so difficult that our tree house ended up a piece of junk. When we finally abandoned the effort, all we had accomplished was to install a very crooked and unstable suicide platform in the top of a loblolly. Occasionally birds used it. Lobster began his ascent. It was difficult going, with the rotted cross timbers, some missing, scattered upward, providing only a vague suggestion of a ladder. He struggled and cursed. Some of the footholds held and others broke away, but he did eventually reach the dilapidated platform. He ever so gingerly crawled directly onto it. It held. He smiled down at me, glasses askew, with a look of proud accomplishment as he sat directly on the weather-worn 2x4s. The platform groaned and creaked. Looking up at him, I began to think less about his challenging climb, but more about his lack of judgment and his eventual descent. With over half of the footholds broken away as he scrambled up, I wasn't sure he would be able to clamber back down. As I was pointing out his folly, up walked Cricket. He was a living smirk. He giggled and snickered a lot, and was able to have those around him laughing with only a word or two. He had an infectious smile, and when he cracked it, everyone nearby could not help but smile too. We usually didn't get the joke, but we laughed just the same. He was lean, but not particularly athletic. I rarely remember a touchdown catch or home run hit. He could run fast, if he needed to, but usually moved around quietly, taking his time. He was there just to be teased and heckled, and was more than happy and sufficiently equipped to return the favor. Cricket looked over at me and up to Lobster high in the tree. He asked me what we were doing. I told him that my brother decided to climb the tree. He smirked and made a disparaging remark about what an idiot Lobster was. With a snicker, he suggested that the only logical thing to do at that point was to chop the tree down. Lobster peered at us and grinned, well out of earshot. I frowned. Cricket turned and walked directly over to Dad's workshop. The garage-type awning door was always open, and there was a wide variety of tools strewn about the well-used workbench inside. Next, he methodically rummaged around, found a large, long-handled axe, walked back to the loblolly, and surveyed the base of its trunk. As Lobster laughed and taunted him from his unstable perch above, Cricket went to work. He began to chop. Cricket was a practiced woodsman and had felled many a loblolly. He moved with skill and efficiency that afternoon, all the time quiet, saying nothing. Occasionally, he would pause and look up at Lobster with a smile. I told him I thought he was crazy and couldn't possibly chop down a tree with my brother perched at the top. I was summarily dismissed. Lobster continued to laugh and taunt, and Cricket continued to chop and smile, and with increasing vigor. It was soon obvious that he was absolutely going to chop this tree down with Lobster stranded in the dilapidated tree house high above. It took Cricket about 30 minutes to complete the job. With a signature crack at the cut that anyone who has ever felled a tree knows marks the point of no return, he yelled, "Timber!" Lobster screamed as the tree began to lean. Luckily, it was heading toward the open backyard and not the power lines just to the right. Cricket knew what he was doing. With his job now complete, he ran like the dickens through the side yard and presumably home. I did not see Cricket again that day. As the falling tree gained momentum, Lobster knew he had only two choices. He could hang on and hope to not get crushed underneath several thousand pounds of loblolly, or jump at the last moment away from the trunk and all the other junk that was coming down with it. While I stood frozen and aghast with mouth wide open, watching the impossible unfold, Lobster jumped. His timing was impeccable. It was not a second before the mass of tree trunk, limbs, and old lumber smashed into the ground with an enormous splintering thud. I felt the concussion of the impact like a punch in the gut. Somehow Lobster's timing had been spot on, or he was just very lucky. Launching himself a good 10 feet away from the smashing hulk as it sprayed branches and busted plywood out across the yard. He hit with a thud and a crunch, rolled 3 times, and stood up with a crooked grin on his face, yet again dodging the odds in a short life challenged by one test after another. His arm looked weird. It was hanging and dangling loosely at an unnatural angle by his side. I could see it was snapped in half, broken clean through. Now in the kitchen, standing before Mom, she took one look at Lobster and me and, with a weary sigh, asked what in the heck had happened. She already knew it must be Sunday. Lobster was in a bit of shock and unable to gather his thoughts. I told her the story. The downed tree remained prone and quite dead across my backyard for a good while, a grim reminder of a poorly constructed tree house used only occasionally by birds and Lobster's near-death experience. Within a few weeks, Dad cut off Lobster's cast in the shop with his power bandsaw. It was too itchy and smelled like a dead goat. The tree was hacked up and hauled away. Mom repeatedly forbid us all to ever ride our bikes or even cross Old Cutler Road. I should have listened. Up next is Chapter 23, and it's called Stay Off Old Cutler.